If you're flying in from out of state to West 605 to visit Mount Rushmore, you got to go through this place. If you're flying in from out of state to go visit the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, you got to go through this place. And if you're flying in to go visit the Badlands, you got to go through this place. This place is Rapid City Regional Airport. The airport began as a municipal airport back in the 1930s. Its first location is the current site of Ellsworth Air Force Base, but eventually the military wanted its own airport, so the municipal airport was moved to its current location in 1950, and then in 1980 it was renamed Rapid City Regional Airport, or R.A.P. Today, Rapid City Regional Airport is a tourist and a business hub.
The neat thing about this airport is that it really is a regional draw. So we draw from about a 3-hour radius of people who will drive to Rapid City to get on a plane and get somewhere. So obviously from a services perspective, super important to us. People who live here use the airport, right? So if they want to go somewhere or take their family somewhere, business or leisure, super critical. But then I also think just air service from the perspective of the state of South Dakota. When businesses look to relocate, they look at a couple different things. One, I would say, is workforce. Two, I would say, is how do I get my people in and out, right? So air service is critical to that. Driving workforce, it's driving business recruitment, retention, expansion, all of those things. So our airport is really, I think it probably gets undersold, but a really critical piece of our infrastructure.
The Black Hills have seen, and I know this with Rapid City, we've seen 3.8 million visitors. Those are people that are coming to spend dollars locally and around the state. Well, we know the state gets 4 cents on a sales tax that those visitors spend. So if we are drawing 3.8 million visitors to the state, that impacts the entire state as well as the communities that we're in. So what happens in the Black Hills greatly impacts the state of South Dakota. And so that is something that we need to keep in mind as we look at potentially funding future expansion here at the airport. It's not only good for the Black Hills region, it is good for the entire state of South Dakota.
I assume that that message, it resonates with lawmakers from the western half of the state, but what about lawmakers from the eastern half?
Well, that's the challenge, is I think when they understand that what happens here greatly impacts their revenues of what they can do in their communities, because we have a lot of sales tax that's collected as a result of the Black Hills region.
Sure.
So because of that sales tax revenue, that is what lawmakers around the state would need to understand, and as well as the communities around the state, that not only is the Black Hills a great place for them to come and visit, it actually gives back to the entire state and helps us keep moving forward in a healthy way. The airport's not just great for tourism, it's great for business. This commercial side that everybody sees of the airport is significant, but there's an entire other section of the airport, the general aviation. That's where we have private aircraft, we have people with hangars, we have businesses that own their own hangars. These are important because as businesses come to Rapid City, one of the things they look for is, do they have a place to park perhaps a plane? And I know that sounds interesting to folks who live around here, but if you have a big company coming to town and they have multiple locations around the country, for them it's more cost effective to have their own aircraft. And so we have to look at, how do we look at the general aviation and how it has a positive impact on the economic growth of Rapid City, because quite frankly, we want Rapid City to be where people prosper. That means it being a safe place to live, having a good job, all of that is a significant part of that. Well, in order to have great jobs, some of the things you have to do is support the economic growth that we see in this region, and that's why the general aviation, that's a whole other half of this complex, is significant to the region as well.
The population of Rapid City and the surrounding area has been growing, and it will continue to grow for the next decade. Part of that growth includes the B-21 Raider mission that's coming soon to Ellsworth Air Force Base. R.A.P. has to keep up and accommodate all that growth, and that means expansion, and expansion is expensive, especially when the money for your expansion project comes from multiple sources: the city, the state, and the federal government.
So projects like this are going to have several different sources of funding. In the case of what we've been working on for this section of the terminal project, we've got some federal airport and FAA airport improvement funding going into it, bipartisan infrastructure law funding, there's local airport funding going into it. So we're also seeking, in discussions with the city, there's going to have to be discussions down the road with the city in terms of local funding to go into it. So terminals aren't like a runway project. A runway project would be funded at 90% federal, 10% local, of which the state would take about 5% of that cost. In a terminal project, we go through and we look at each room to be able to determine eligibility of that because the FAA doesn't.
You have to go room to room to room to figure out who's going to pay for what?
That is exactly how terminal projects go. It's a process that takes years.
So it's not as simple as, hey, here's the whole project, feds are going to cover 75% of it, and state and city, they'll cover the rest. It's never that easy.
It's never that easy.
Well, the airport has the challenges that come with growth, just like the rest of the state, to be honest with you. And part of that means we have a terminal expansion project in order to add more services. That includes better baggage handling behind the scenes. Also includes, growing the number of gates that we have so that we can get more providers, more carriers into the region. It also means down the road as well, we're going to have to look at upgrading the runway. That's one of the interesting things folks don't think about, but runways require maintenance, and at times they require replacement. And so as we look down the road, and the airport really works on a very big vision, very much decades out vision. And that's stuff that we're going to have to reverse engineer. How do we make sure that we have the right runway, the right terminals? Just here on the commercial side, we also have a general aviation side that's very important to the area.
So we do have capacity to add air service with some existing carriers, but when you start to look at bringing in new carriers, that's the project on the table, right? Is taking the airport from 6 gate to, I believe, to 12 gates, right? So that we can offer new services and new gates and really start to expand that service. I think the interesting part of the conversation that we're probably not touching on is we're a seasonal market from a leisure perspective. So how do we start to grow those off seasons to make sure that our air service can stay year round? So
with business meetings?
Sports, right? So youth sports is
right.
Obviously huge in the off season. Absolutely, meetings and conventions.
Yeah.
Really talking about the things to see and do in Rapid in the winter, right? Or in the off season versus just, hey, come in the summer when everybody comes. So it's really finding ways to start creating compression in the summer, right? Like we're pretty full to start pushing out on those shoulder seasons. And that's why year-round air service is one of the focuses too.
Rapid City Regional Airport's expansion project is divided up into 3 phases. The first phase involves the main area of the airport. They'll be revamping the ticket counters, updating the baggage system, and expanding and updating the TSA security checkpoint. You have to do all this construction while still carrying on normal operation.
The trickiest part of working on an airline terminal on an active airport is just that, is having to go through and make sure that we've got airplanes continuing to function, people being able to work around those airplanes, be able to get baggage out to the airplanes. All those things become a fine ballet dance of trying to work through it. And they're not perfect, and it's not without some level of headache.
The second phase of the project involves the number of gates, going from the current 7 gates to 12.
The problem is that we looked at going to a 10-gate terminal. Based on that, by the time we actually got to the end of our planning cycle, a 10-gate terminal would have been too small. So it was really a tough decision for the board to say, do we want to design 10 or do we want to design 12? But then also looking at it from a standpoint of there's a financial component out here. I mean, all this has to be funded. This infrastructure has to be developed to keep the community growing. So, they want to be fiscally responsible, but they also don't want to look back and say, geez, we should have went 2 more gates further. So the planning cycle really shows 12 gates in here, and that's what we're building to. We could get by with 10, but that's probably only going to reach, you know, so far.
You gotta look further down the road.
You gotta look further down the road, yeah.
And the third phase of the project involves expanding the car rental area. All three phases of the project are going to take about a decade to finish.
We compete with other airports nationwide for some of these major projects like this to be able to get discretionary funding. We also work with our congressional delegation on things like congressional directed spending or earmarks, you know. So there's those pieces that also come into play as well that we work through the process. But in order to, you really have to be designed and almost shovel ready in an effort to be able to really have a good discussion about getting the funding and the needs that are there.
I'm going to ask a really dumb question, all right? Why can't you do all the projects all at the same time?
So we would have, you know, again, when you look at, if we were paying for 100% of this for Rapid City, so like the Civic Center, the community is going to fund 100% of it, we can bid it all and move all in one time. But when you're looking at outside sources of funding for federal funding, potentially state funding into the future, we're not getting all those funds in 1 year. So you look at a project like this being anywhere from $150 to $200 million fully constructed, that would be a huge tax on the nationwide system of airport funding. So, you know, when at this point, you know, it's at about $4.5 billion a year that funds the entire system for all the airports across the United States. So there is a timeline, and that's why projects like this take sometimes years to get taken care of.
About 350,000 people get on a plane at Rapid City Regional Airport every year, and all of them have to go through a security checkpoint because, well, we live in a different world since 9/11.
While we do care a lot about the experience and how folks come through in terms of the process, our utmost responsibility is to security for the passengers as they come through. And so we have invested lots of money as it relates to technology, which has made it a little bit more convenient for folks to come through security, while at the same time enhancing our security posture to make sure they're as safe as they can be as they come through security. Yep.
Well, let's take a little walk here through the security checkpoint with the understanding that there are some things we can show and some things we cannot.
Absolutely.
Okay, what can we show versus what we can't?
So for the most part, you can show folks coming through, interacting with our officers. What we can focus on and show are the actual images that we use to interpret what we see. Yep.
Okay, all right, well, let's take a walk down there.
And kind of as I mentioned before, this is our pre-check here. This is our standard screening. Pre-check is an important piece, $78, 5 years that you'll get, and you get a more expedited process compared to the standard side of screening, which normally we try to emphasize 10 minutes or less.
Because the background information is done prior to you flying.
Yep. Yeah, they go through the whole entire process. They provide some information. The government vets the person, gives them the clearance, and so ultimately at this point, once they check in, they get their pre-check, and this is where they come through security. Yep.
You've got something over your right shoulder here that I wanted to ask you about. Mm-hmm. Check your carry-on baggage for firearms before entering the screening checkpoint. We recently had a gentleman here who forgot that he had packed 2 loaded handguns into his carry-on bags. Is this something that you continue to see, not just here in the Black Hills, West 605 region, but across the country?
Unfortunately, it is, Kevin. And I can tell you just here alone at Rapid City, we had 8 guns that were detected all year. So far this year, and we're not done, it's been 9 already. And so this is a concern that obviously we want folks to know where they have their weapons at all time before they come through, because there's no way we would want a firearm on the the cabin of the airplane. With that said, though, they still have opportunities of bringing their firearms. It's just checking it properly, right?
Put it in checked
That's
baggage.
correct. That's correct.
What do you think is going on? If we've got 9 cases of this sort already, and the year's not even done yet, is it people just not being properly educated, or they just don't care, or they think, hey, I can walk around with it anywhere else, why can't I put it in my carry-on at the airport? What do you think's going on?
It's a good question. While I don't have a solid answer in terms of the exact reason for it, it could be a combination of, but I can tell you that TSA does a good job of trying to put the word out through publications and media to make sure passengers are aware of what firearms are coming through and reminding them that this is not something you can do, that there are consequences for it, such as revoking your pre-check status. So.
For a full list of what you can and cannot bring on board a flight, check out the TSA website, tsa.gov, and then click on the What Can I Bring link on the upper right-hand corner. Making your way through the TSA security checkpoint takes a few minutes, and the whole process can feel just a little invasive. But if you remember, it wasn't too long ago when the process was even more, shall we say, uncomfortable. Think body pat-downs. As time went by, a more modern security check technology came along.
Oftentimes, passengers, obviously, rightfully so, don't want to be patted down. And I can assure you from our standpoint with TSA, that is not what we, are looking forward to doing. And so we have technology such as this, where it alarms, and we're able to specifically pat the area down that is in question without having to go, as you mentioned before, full body pat downs pre-TSA. This kind of technology enhances our security posture because this allows our officers to zero in and focus on the areas of concern via pat down to alarm that alarms and clear the person through. So yes, it absolutely enhances our ability to do a job versus not having one of these machines. The technology has its system in place that our officers are trained to understand in terms of how to use it. So their main focus is once they see what's on that screen, they provide the appropriate procedure, and the person is good to go.
Okay, so that took a matter of seconds.
Yep.
Okay, and then if there is something that gives the agents concern, what happens then?
So at that point, they would provide the procedure in accordance with their standard operating procedures to resolve the alarm that sometimes is in the form of a pat-down, clear it, and then send the person on their way.
The whole process of air travel can be stressful sometimes, especially if you're running late and there's a chance of missing your flight. Yeah, we've all had those days, but the bottom line is you gotta keep your cool.
Unfortunately, what we do find ourselves are in situations where passengers come through, whether they're having personal issues or just the interaction that they had with our officers, take out their frustration on some of our employees, and obviously we don't tolerate that very much. It's important for us to make sure we create a good work environment for our employees, but at the same time we want to try to make sure that the passengers that are coming through understand why we do what we do when they come through. And so it does make it difficult for us when passengers don't behave in a way that they should, and it makes it difficult for our officers to do the job. But again, they're professionals, they're trained for this, and they know what to do. So obviously we have a variety of kinds of training that we provide our officers, whether dealing with passengers, obviously security procedures that they apply. And so for us, it's important to make sure that our officers are well prepared to be able to deal with these interactions as they come about. And so we do have definitely extensive training that's provided in customer relations, customer interactions to ensure that they are as prepared as they can be for those interactions. Yeah.
Security checkpoints at the airport aren't going away anytime soon, and once again, you can thank 9/11 for that. In fact, Briceño says the TSA will be investing even more in their people and in their technology in the future. The folks behind the scenes at Rapid City Regional Airport are already looking to the future. I mean, how can they not? West 605 has so much to offer. So much to see and do, and more people are finding out about it.
You know, obviously we look 20 years in the future when trying to put together planning and design on these things. So because it can take, like we're talking, a decade to fund a project. So, you know, you've got to be planned well in advance of where you're going. So part of it is that we look at all the trends. We look at the community growth. We look at, you know, just natural tourism growth, business growth, and try and pull all those statistics together to create what's called a forecast. And part of that forecast still shows us growing well into 2035.
Well, I think a lot of folks want to see more options for carriers. And the way you get more options for carriers is that you don't just have a busy summer month, but you also expand into the shoulder season and into the winter. So if Rapid City can have consistent air travel throughout the year, that means money. And these airlines, they're in it to make a profit. So we need to show that Rapid City is not just profitable, you know, for 3, 4, 5, 6 months out of the year, but all year round. And so when you use the airport in the wintertime, when you take trips around the country in the off season, that's only gonna help us make our case to get more options here at the airport.
But yeah, I think sometimes people just live here or move here and they think the airport's just a given. It's just a service that, well, why wouldn't Rapid City have an airport?
Or maybe it self-supports.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's actually, it's owned by the city, so that's not exactly true. And I know they're doing a great job right now looking at capital stack or, you know, dollar options to say, how do we get the next 6 gates? And the city of Rapid City isn't going to be the sole funder on that. But I do think, getting back to what you say, I think people live in a community and think the airport is just here because it's just a given. And we're so lucky to have the airport we have. Aesthetically, from a services perspective, right, they do so many things. We service around 700,000 people at the airport every year. But yeah, it's not a given, right? And it's really up to all of us to advocate, to say we do want expansion. We do want air service that goes to the west to really get some things done.
Growth, money, technology. 3 words that are going to play major roles in the future of Rapid City Regional Airport and in the future of West 605.